So thank you again for sharing all of that wonderful advice and great stories. Next up, we have Beth McDaniel from Voc Rehab. And Beth, I'll just embarrass you here and say that, I think we all kind of know that there are Voc Rehab counselors that you'll want to get because they have a reputation for doing a great job. And then there's others that, maybe you kind of wish maybe they were a little more invested in your future, or your son or daughter's future. So you're obviously in the first category, or you wouldn't be on here. You've got a reputation of someone who knows how to get things done. Maybe that is about getting transition plans and IEPs. Maybe it's career exploration. Maybe there's some kind of secret sauce out there that you know about and could share with us and wouldn't be so secret anymore. I don't know. But can you tell us how you'd work with a high school student to help them be well prepared for a successful transition?
Sure. Well, thank you, Tony. I just gave it my best effort all the years that I was a counselor. So been with the agency for 19 years. So sometimes it just comes with experience as well and time. It takes time to learn how to be a VR counselor. But what I did when I was in the field for nearly 18 years was, when working with a high school student, it's really ideal to try to get started with that student at least in their junior year. Earlier is okay as well, but that junior year we like to think of as the golden year, simply because there are a lot of things that can be done during that time, mainly building a rapport for one thing, so that they have your trust and know that you have their best interests at heart, and establishing a working relationship with that student. Those things take time. And the parent as well, of course, they're a key player in this. During that time as a counselor, I would work with that student and trying to get any VR stuff we had to get done completed. So by the time they got to their senior year, things could be sort of already lined up and in place for any transition services that we were going to provide once they left high school, if we hadn't already been providing some of those services already. A lot of that transition umbrella may fall under the school, but VR, there's nothing wrong with us getting in there that junior year and starting to work with that student and getting things lined up. And of course, if we get a senior that is, coming in late or whatever, that's fine. We can start with them as well. But ideally getting in with that junior and getting things started. But what I would do is, in my, what I say digging in, is individualize it, cater it to that student. What even though there's a lot of services that are provided that look similar for a lot of our consumers, we want to look at that individual student and know what are their particular needs, what are their interests, what's their disability and the limitations of that disability, first and foremost, and then base that on suiting those transition needs around what their needs and interests are. Some common things that I would typically do would be career interest inventories and assessments. A lot of those are online. OVR at one point had our own vocational assessment, and sometimes it's also warranted to call in a professional vocational assessor who can do a more formal assessment if needed. But a lot is more sophisticated online than ever before. A lot of times I would dig in and use ONET. ONETonline.org is a great tool to use. They have a navigation tool that'll help students explore careers of interest in a really in-depth way and help them see where their areas of interest lie, but also the requirements of careers that they may be interested in. And within ONET, it also has an interest inventory that they can complete that will accompany their research. So keeping the student informed is also important about local career fairs and resources in their community, like volunteer opportunities that maybe help them gain some skills and experience. And then another very important thing to do, and the responsibility truly of the counselor, is to help that student prepare for successful transition by also discussing local and national labor market trends or labor market information. We call it LMI, because that ultimately is going to also guide that student in making a good choice for themselves. If there are careers that aren't in demand and where they plan on residing at some point, then that may not have been good guidance on my behalf as a VR counselor. And many times what I would also do would help familiarize them with, what is a FAFSA? If they're planning on going to post-secondary training of any type, what is a FAFSA? First of all, free, federal financial aid application, and what does that look like, and familiarize them with those types of things, and also getting them resources. If they're planning on going to post-secondary training, KHEA, Kentucky Higher Education Systems Authority, has a great place that orients students on their website about post-secondary training, scholarships, pre-curriculum checklists, college curriculum checklists that help a student determine whether or not they are ready for post-secondary training, or if there's something more that they need to work on in order to be ready for college. So going back to that junior year, this helps give them some time to prep for that. And then sometimes it's as simple as just meeting with the student regularly and helping them to continue to clarify, hash out, and establish goals. That takes time to do that, and you can't necessarily do that in just a couple of conversations. So maybe every other time I would go to the school, I may try to meet with that student briefly. And I would just say it's always a good idea to involve parents and guardians when you can, so that they know what's going on as well with the process as much as possible. It's really about maintaining rapport with the student so that they don't fall between the cracks, so to speak, and meeting with them on a fairly regular basis is very helpful towards that. The other thing to discuss with students are their transportation goals. Do they need a driver's license? Do they need driver's training? Would they need a vehicle modification if they have a disability that requires that? Where do they plan to live after graduation? So independent living, what's that going to look like for them? Do they have plans, like I said, we've talked about post-secondary training? Do they receive SSI benefits and maybe have concerns about how work could or maybe won't impact them in any way? And so possibly benefits counseling if they need it to help them understand their SSI and also the benefits of work. There are many things that can be done. So it starts with meeting with that student regularly and early as possible so that you can get all of those things coordinated, because it does take a lot of paperwork and involvement and meetings to be able to do those things.
Yeah, wow. I wish I would have had you as a book rehab counselor. That was some great information and some great resources. And my next question will probably overlap with some of the things that you already said, but if I've learned one thing from working closely with a lot of voc rehab projects, it's that I get really confused about all of the terms, all the acronyms, all the services. I hear WIOA, I hear PREETs, I hear transition services. I don't know what I qualify for. Let's say I'm a parent of a 16-year-old boy, and we've got our first meeting. So we started early, but I still don't know what's going on with all this stuff. And I hear, I've got 5 friends and they all tell me different things. Ask Beth about this, ask Beth about the other thing. And do you qualify for transition services, or are you just PREETs? Well, how's WIOA going to impact all this? What do you say to that nervous and overwhelmed parent that's trying to keep it all straight in their head?
Well, first, I would say if I were in your shoes, I would feel the same way, but we will walk through this. And so one of the first things I would try to do is explain, what does OVR do? We help individuals with disabilities to find and maintain suitable and rewarding employment, and it fosters independence and integration into being a productive member of society. And along with employment, may come some necessary training. When feasible, we can help support someone to acquire the skills they need to attain that suitable employment or career path that they choose. I would provide a consumer guide and my contact information, because let's face it, they may not remember everything that I say the first time around. I know I wouldn't. And so I'd remind them that, while terms and systems can sometimes be confusing and intimidating, we can also help explain it as many times as they need to get their head around the world of OVR. It is complex. And there are a lot of different transition services and services, period, for our consumers. So what may be helpful to know is that OVR transition services is an umbrella term that offers many specific and individualized services based on the needs of their child, that student, and eventually that consumer. Another important point is that while pre-ETS is important, because that falls under WIOA, another term that you used, pre-ETS is short-term and it's great, but it's short-term in nature. And so it does help build a foundation, but further OVR services are almost going to always be needed to help a student with their transition and employment goals, be it long-term or short-term, training required or not, whatever that looks like. Further VR services would be necessary. And so at some point, an eventual application for services would be needed. With regard to transition services, I'd explain to the parent and student that OVR transition services may look like in a general sense, but to help, I would also ask some probing questions about what are your goals as a student? What are your interests, strengths, weaknesses, disability limitations? And also try to engage what that parent's expectations are as well. That's also important. Sometimes parents' expectations and students' expectations may not always align. And so we have to find a middle ground there. These conversations can also help guide further conversations about to be more individualized, to allow that student for us to be able to provide relevant information specifically for that student and parent about what exact OVR services may serve them best. If the student may, for instance, doesn't plan on going on post-secondary training, would it be appropriate to refer that student for a program that would offer job search so that when they leave high school, if they offer that in their school, that maybe we help them with finding employment upon exiting high school? That's only if they plan on maybe not going to post-secondary training. If the student is presently receiving pre-ETS in their sophomore year, if they're a sophomore, then I would encourage them to apply for VR services at least by the end of their sophomore year, first part of junior year. And if needed, an OVR application can always be taken sooner. That's going to be dependent on what that individual needs. And another thing to remember is even if you forget about OVR for the next year or two as a parent or student, if you hang on to our card, you can always come back and reapply if you didn't apply in the first place, or if you applied and then the student, just said, this isn't for me right now, they can always come back in the future. I think that's a misunderstanding or misconception that some parents and students often have, is that they may not decide to pursue OVR right then, and then not realize until many years later that they could have come back sooner and reapplied for VR services. Another thing I would like to ensure that they receive services is I would encourage them to hold on to my information so they can come back. Or I've had students that contacted a teacher 2 or 3 years later and saying, who was that lady that used to come talk to me about jobs? So they would at least, say that was Beth, probably Harper back then, but McDaniel, and here's her number. So that way they at least have a way to reach out to me. Many times with parents that are maybe apprehensive about the complexities of VR, or what seems like complexities to them at the time, is I would go ahead and try to set a next appointment with them or their child, the student, to keep them on my radar, and vice versa. People want to know that they can trust you. And if you make them a priority and schedule the next appointment while you're meeting with them, then it also helps them feel more invested in this program too, for themselves. And I'll say that, while it is the OVR counselor's responsibility to follow up, it is equally as important for the consumer, their parent, their family to reach out as well. I would remind them that I'm there for them and that this is their case. If they open a case with VR, this is their life work, but this is a good first step in helping them see they have ownership in their case and life goals and responsibilities as a student, and as a parent playing a role in that as well. But at the same time, not everybody is there yet. And so I would try to meet them where they're at. And I believe it's the counselor's responsibility to encourage and foster that relationship by investing in them with the time, by attempting to stay in contact when you can.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I know in my own transition journey, I used voc rehab services, and I felt like this is my one shot. If I don't make it right, if I don't get it the first time, I'm in trouble because they're not going to invest in me again. And what I'm hearing you saying is that that's not really true.
Right.
You can come back at any point and voc rehab will be there for you.
That's exactly right. There's no limits there.
Well, I wish I would have known that. That's not your fault.
I wish you would have too.
Because I know maybe I would have taken a few more chances and screwed a few more things up and come out ahead. So you've touched on my next question as well too, but this question is, I think we all kind of have the idea that voc rehab exists to get people jobs. And I don't think that's wrong. But can you say a little bit about the difference between getting a job and getting started in your career? Because I think you've talked a little bit about how you really do a lot of exploration. Maybe that's where that comes in. But we see too often, it's one of the shortcomings of the yo-yo of the data that I presented in the beginning, is that we don't really know what kind of jobs these young people have. We just know that they've had them for 90 days and they pay minimum wage and that kind of stuff. But how do you differentiate? How do you find a young person a career instead of a job to get by?
Right. And I think that's also a matter of perspective. Who's my audience? If that person feels like job A is a career for them, then we need to work towards what it takes to hopefully find that job. If all the other things are lined up and it's feasible for them, that's not to say though that entry-level employment isn't good. I feel like entry-level employment is always a good place to start for a young person. But, maybe they've not had a lot of work experience. And so even volunteer work or other types of experience, such as internships, may be a way to help build their skills and their resume as well. All of this is going to be based on, what are their interests? And so I would encourage the student to do these types of things first in their areas of interest, when and if possible, mainly because exploring those things will help them learn a little more about this potential career, if they view it as a career, whatever that is. Sometimes people's definition of a career might be getting some type of training. Some people, they may view it differently than that. And so I would just encourage that student to do those types of things in their areas of interest when and if possible. And I would explore that with them in ways, as well. We could research together. We dig in and do some research about what does it take to get this job here? Okay, let's go through step A, B, and C, if this is a career for you.
Oh.
By doing so, I think this helps the student verify whether their primary interest area is indeed what they want to do for a career, but it also gives them hands-on experience, like I said a minute ago. I would also research with them ONET. I've mentioned ONET a lot, but it was a tool that I used quite a bit because it provides a plethora of information, really, and a lot of details about many occupations in that particular area that maybe that they're interested in. From there, we would make a plan to determine what's needed to get employment in that career or in that field. Is it going to be short-term training, college that's required, or could an internship or volunteer position help them build that resume and towards that goal? So sometimes I think, depending on who's saying it, a career could be anything, really, if it's dependent on that consumer's view of what their career wants to be. It's just a matter of us figuring out what it's going to take to get that employment in that career that they perceive as what they want to do.
Yeah, thanks. Another great answer. And my last question, I'm going to ask a few of our panelists this, but um, how do you define a successful outcome? You know, it may not always be getting a job or, you know, going to college. Even if it is going to college, you know, that's not an outcome, a long-term outcome. That's hopefully a short-term outcome that will lead to a job. But are there outcomes that you can see that a young person might have that say are not employment related, or at least not paid employment related?
Right. I think, you know, there are definitely many ways to define success. And for OVRs measure, at least, the primary way that OVR defines success is if a consumer receives OVR services, obtains competitive integrated employment, and maintains it at least for 90 days or more. This definition is just really the basic tenets of how OVR receives federal funding. So we as an agency have to objectively measure that when a case is being closed as being either closed successfully or unsuccessfully. Those are broad terms, of course, but it does clearly define our performance as an agency as it relates back to the federal dollar match. But, you know, with that being said, that's a big but. In a more subjective view, successful doesn't always have to equal employment. It just means the case may not be closed as VR successful, but that doesn't mean somebody didn't reach some type of milestone somewhere along the way. It may be a step in the right direction for a person in their personal goals, such as a skill acquired, making strides, but employment maybe wasn't achieved yet. Maybe they received some type of VR services that help them when they move forward with big picture goals, but just not there yet with employment. So Veronica, my coworker, who is also a VR counselor, she told me about an instance that she had where she had a student who received VR services. She considered it successful, even though it wasn't, you know, the true success in our sense of VR world. He did attain a lot of skills. He needed transportation training. He needed to learn how to use public transit independently. And so that was considered to be, in her eyes, and mine too, really subjectively successful, if you will, because he did acquire useful skill. And then when and if he is ready to return to VR and reapply for VR services, then he has this attained already and chunked that skill to as a newly acquired skill that then he could eventually use to help him maintain employment at some point. You know, something to note is, did the consumer reach milestones that will contribute to their ultimate goals related to employment or independence for that matter, especially when they come back and reapply for services, because many people do. They're just chunking things as they go along, as they can handle them, and whatever that looks like for them, whatever works for them. We want people to be happy.
Yeah, that is definitely the case. You said it much better than I had it in my head, because attaining skills that'll help you be happy in life. I was thinking of my hippie friend that claims that voc rehab helped him attain enlightenment and become one with the universe. And you know, that's a score for me. But
yeah, that's pretty awesome. That's better than employment, I think.
Yeah, probably. What do you need employment for if you attain enlightenment? All right. Well, that's those are all the questions I have for you. But again, stick around because there are, I'm sure, more questions that people will have for you, and we'll leave some time for them at the end. So, Teresa, you are up next to talk to us about higher education. And my first question for you is that the data that I showed in the beginning showed that about 20% of our students who exit high school with IEPs go on to some form of post-secondary education. So what options are out there for continuing education as well as financing education for our young people with disabilities?
Good question, Tony. So thank you for having me on as a panelist. And I'm going to answer those questions for all the folks listening in today. So let me share my screen real quick. And can someone let me know if I'm doing that successfully?
We can
You
see it.
are.
You're a success.
Great. Okay. So let's see here if I can move it. Super. All right. So a couple of things that I'm going to talk about for the next, let's say 20 minutes or so, are things related to transitioning to post-secondary education and answering Tony's question. So we're going to talk about those options. What are they, and what does transitioning to post-secondary education actually even mean? We're going to talk a little bit about if that means going to a college or community college and all the other options. And then we're going to talk a little bit about if that is occurring, then what kinds of things need to happen for a student who's entering that new environment? What places do they need to go to on campus? What resources? We can talk a little bit about accommodations and things like that. So what are the options, Tony? Well, here's a few of them. So when we think traditionally of going to post-secondary education, many people think about colleges and universities. And yes, sure, those are great options. And as you showed us in your data, some students are doing that. So we think about, in Kentucky, we think about our colleges and universities, U of L, UK, and then we think of smaller regional colleges. These are smaller, right, than the universities, like WKU and EKU. And then as we kind of move down the scale, we have a lot of private colleges, like Midway and Transy and Asbury. And we have community and technical colleges, which we have KCTCS all across our state. And, within all those locations, they have specialized programs, 2-year, 4-year, and beyond. So those are great options, of course. And there are so many differences just with those options. But if we expand that, we can also think about our students who may have intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities. So in Kentucky, we have CTP programs, comprehensive transition programs, and they've been around for a little while and they are growing in number. UK has one now. We have a college and career program. There's one at Murray State, NKU, and there's one at Bluegrass Community and Technical College. And so getting in one of those has its own application sort of process that college has set up. But even if we think beyond that, there's the Carl D. Perkins Center, which I can't remember if Beth mentioned this or not, but this is an option if a student's working with OVR. They're located in Thelma, Kentucky, and they not only provide a place to stay for a student and assessments there, but they also help the students get in some college and like specialized courses. If you want to be a beautician or something very specialized, where the courses are really just having to do with that sort of curriculum. And then, there's other options, trades, vocational schools that teach primarily technical job-specific training so that students can go directly into a field like carpentry, mechanics, and stuff like that. So you see, there are so many options. How do we think through all of this? Well, it's really very individualized, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. But let's think about if a family decides to take one of these options, what are the kinds of changes that students have to go through? Well, first of all, if you see this on the left here of this, we have the student, some things that they're going to be responsible for now in these higher educational settings. And then what a college or university or a technical training program would be responsible for. And here we definitely see differences because this is a transitional time where students would have to take more responsibility for their own success. They're covered under the ADA, where previously they may be covered under IDEA, right? And maybe in high school, they had their IEP meetings and their teachers and other folks attending to help determine what was best for them. Now, at this level, the student is going to have to meet with somebody at the school to try to sit down and talk about what sort of accommodations and what kinds of things can happen so that student can be successful. So most of the time, colleges and universities in places like this have disability services, and they have their own processes at each college for how a student would document a disability and how they determine what accommodations that are appropriate for that student. And it depends on, so many factors: the student's history, the accommodations they've had in the past, what the student is saying, and what their families are saying. So when they have those meetings, they come up with accommodations that are most appropriate. And, we know our students too at this transitional phase are going to be more responsible for seeking out resources that are available to everybody. Plus, making sure they're, connected with OVR and getting those extra services and extra help that they can get. They're also going to be responsible for more things to take care of themselves on let's say on like a college campus. So we'll talk more about accommodations in a sec, but one of the questions that Tony wanted me to address is like the admissions process. Well, it's hard to say exactly because every college has their own process, right? So some colleges, it was standard to take the ACT, and some colleges, like community colleges, they want you to take a placement test. And sometimes these things are used to help determine where a student should start their coursework. Now, I know you all have heard this, but through our last few years of COVID, there's been a lot of talk about some colleges not even using the ACT, which I think is interesting. So it's really best to check with that college and find out exactly what they want a student to do as an entrance sort of admissions process. In addition to kind of jumping through those hoops and applying, something's really important for students with disabilities and their families. And that is, colleges can't ask a student if they have a disability during this pre-admission phase, right? Nor can they disqualify a student based solely on the fact that they have a disability. So jumping back now to, let's say the student is entered one of these colleges, universities, or a training center, something that's going to lead to skills that they need for a job or a career. A lot of times these conversations include accommodations, academic accommodations. If the student's living on a campus, it would include housing accommodations. So here's just a very short list of some of those. So many students that go on to college do require and need some kind of what we call test accommodations. And typically it's things like extended time, or let's say the student has a difficult time with a large classroom environment and they need it to be really quiet. So having a low distraction test environment is important. Some students need their exams read out loud. Typically now that's done with some sort of software application. So test accommodations are very important. Things like having their textbooks electronically provided, and there's different ways of doing that. That's really crucial to a lot of students' success because, one of the things that happens in this next level of education is the student is going to do a lot more reading than they ever have before. Right? They have to really sit down and read through stuff, and it's really difficult to read a lot. So having ebooks that can be put on your computer and then just have them read out loud really helps students get through material. Now, if they're living on campus, or if they're just bringing their service animal with them, that is definitely allowed through the ADA. There's been a lot of talk about this in recent years, like what is a service animal exactly? Well, under the ADA, it's dogs and miniature ponies. Yeah, but we do know that a lot of students who have moved to campuses are really wanting to have an emotional support animal, and that is totally different than a service animal, right? And colleges, universities, and other places have come up with processes and paperwork that students have to do and go through in order for that determination to be made. So, it's really important not to just assume if you're going to be on a campus, live on a campus, that you can bring a cat or another emotional support animal that a student might need, maybe because they have mental health problems or something else and they need the comfort of that animal. It's really important to go through all the process and have that completely resolved before you arrive on campus with an animal. Another sort of accommodation that is very, very helpful in so many ways is a lot of disability services offices will offer what we call priority or early registration. And they'll have a process for that as well. And that's something for you to find out about. It's really important for certain groups of students. So let's say the student has a physical limitation of some kind and they're on a bigger campus. One of the things they're going to think about is what should a schedule look like and how long does it take me to get from point A to point B? Where are these classes at? So having a jump on registering early can help a student schedule classes that are at a certain time, that allows them time in between to get to different places and to try to do that successfully. So another one I just listed here was, and it seems to be really important for students, is once they're into the beginning of the semester, many times the disability services, they'll have a way to communicate those accommodations to each of the students' instructors. And that's really important piece that I think leads to student success. And that's the communication piece with each instructor. So having a letter from DS or having them send an email to an instructor lets the instructor know what kinds of things should be provided from the start of the semester. Now, I have to say this, when I worked with students at a college, some of the students were apprehensive. Then when they came to college, they didn't always want to just start using accommodations right away. And we strongly encourage that. But some of them who waited for a little while found out later in the semester that when they did ask for some accommodations, they found out that these things are not retroactive. Right? So let's say a student was in a course and let's say they got a bad grade, but they did not ask for a test accommodation. Then they wanted to come back and get accommodation. Then the instructor is not required to give them another test, right? Or to go backwards in any sort of way. So it's so important to start the semester with good communication, with everybody. Having the right auxiliary aids is also important. And this is sort of a list was on the previous page, but it has a couple others on here. So note takers, some students find it really difficult to keep up with notes in a classroom. So some disability services will have note takers. There's also different devices like a smart pen or an echo pen that record lectures. There's a lot of cool apps and programs that students can use to make sure that they get notes from a class. And other kinds of assistive technology as well. And then of course, captioning, having interpreters, and all of those things are really important to all students who need them. Now, I've been talking about the kinds of accommodations that can be provided, right? But what about some things that colleges and universities and training centers are not required to do? Well, this is a really short list, but they're not required to provide the students a laptop or specialized assistive technology, meaning prescribed devices. They're not required to provide a student a personal attendant or other personal services. These are things that families have to set up before the student enters these experiences. And many times working with OVR, they can help them work some of this out. Another sort of service is an individualized type tutoring, like a one-on-one, where a tutor would just meet with that one student all the time. So those are usually set up through different means as well. Now, Tony, let's get to your other question. And that is, how do people pay for this? Well, there are lots of different ways to pay for it, and this may not be a total list, but here are some good ways. Obviously, the first way, the family could pay for it, right? In all instances, families should do all of their research about the cost of going to any of these training programs, colleges, or universities. And the cost at, let's say, a university, there's a lot of cost involved. It's not just tuition. Many times there's fees added on, different classes may have an additional fee. There's all kinds of things are added in. If the student, and some of them are kind of surprises, for example, at some colleges where they've invested a lot of money, let's say in the, the student gymnasiums and all the extra cool stuff that there is at a university, sometimes there's just a fee tacked on. It's like a student fee or a student life fee or something like that. And then, of course, if the student is planning on living on campus, there's housing to consider. And not only housing, but sometimes if the student's living in housing, they also require, sometimes first-year students and beyond, to purchase some sort of meal plan, right? And there's different levels of that with different cost. So what I'm saying is there's a lot of cost involved, and it should be thoroughly researched by the family. But other ways to pay for it, of course, Beth mentioned Kia, and students in Kentucky should be able to to go to Kia and look and see, sign into their profile or develop their profile to see lots of stuff that they could be benefiting from. We want them to fill out the FAFSA ASAP, meaning as soon as possible, because I'm sure many of you all know that's an entrance for the family to put in all their financial information, and that goes to all schools that they apply to. And it helps determine what kind of assistance, that a family could get, not only external funds, but internal funds related to a particular college. We know there are federal grants, like a Pell Grant and others that students could qualify for. There are state grants or university grants. There are scholarships, like in Kentucky. We have a very cool one called the Kentucky Work Ready Scholarship. And I really strongly suggest that people Google that one and try to find out how those scholarships are being provided. There's also work study. Some families have saved for college and they've invested in college savings plans. There's that HEAS money that students get from their grades in high school and their ACT scores. And then, one of the last things to consider if it needs be is, the family could take out a private loan.